Hey kids, how you doing today? I'm standing out front of a Veterans of Foreign Wars outpost. That's a VFW hall out here in Somers Point, New Jersey. And as you can see, it is a place, an organization for Americans that have served in wars for our country and served our country on foreign soil. Veterans of Foreign Wars. And many World War II veterans have served our country and came back afterwards and established these outposts so they could all be together and talk with each other and support each other because, as one man said, war is hell. And afterwards, it's good to have the camaraderie of people that have had the same experience as you, and you can support each other. So you've had some pretty heavy history in the last 2 days on the Holocaust. And thankfully, we're past that now. And thankfully, you can look at how the tides of war turned in favor of the Allies. We had decided, that is, the Americans and the British had decided that they would defeat Nazism at any cost. It was total war. There was no negotiating. They weren't going to have an armistice or a compromise or a peace settlement. They were going to defeat Nazism. Now, they didn't know the extent of the Holocaust when these decisions were made, but they did know one thing. Nazism could not be allowed to exist in a world where we want goodness to prevail. And goodness did prevail. And that is the moral of this World War II story. As you'll find out, the big three. Here's the big three. That's Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin. Stalin ended up being an ally. The Russians ended up being an ally because the Nazis never intended to have a peace with them. They always intended to invade and take over and subjugate the Slavic peoples to their the Third Reich and the ultimate world that Hitler envisioned. So the Allies were not comfortable with each other. After all, there were communists and free liberal democracies working together, but they were all together fighting a much worse evil, Nazism. You'll also find out a few things. The major battles in the Pacific against the Japanese, these were done with aircraft carriers. That is huge ships in which you could land airplanes and the Air Force would actually fight out over sea, but these were technically naval battles. Now, there were battleships. For example, there are many of these battleships are in reserve now and are used as historical sites. For instance, take a look at this, the SS Battleship New Jersey. Now, that battleship is docked at Camden, and if you've ever gone to a concert over at the BB&T over in Camden, you've been right by the Battleship New Jersey, which you can visit today. It's an excellent, excellent site, and you get an idea of what those ships were about. But the major battles in the Pacific were really aerial, against battleships, against Air Force carriers, aircraft carriers. And it's really intense. So we started winning somewhat in the East, in the Pacific. By 1943, we had defeated much of the Italian occupation in northern Africa, and we were able to march up the boot. And you'll find out that by 1943, we had pretty much defeated the fascists in Italy. But obviously, we needed to get to Germany. We needed to get to Berlin. We needed to get to Adolf Hitler. So how can that be done? I mean, after all, the the Alps prevent anybody from coming up Italy and trying to invade the rest of Europe. I mean, it's just too difficult of a terrain to get all the men and materials that were needed for the invasion. So it was decided under the direction of Dwight D. Eisenhower that the largest amphibious invasion of all time would occur, and that is the invasion of Normandy, D-Day. Now, the men had to take the beachheads. And that was not an easy thing. D-Day is an amazing story where we first got what's called a toehold in Europe, Northern Europe. And it's from there in Normandy. You could take a look on the map. It's from here in Normandy where the forces were able to push back the Nazis, liberate Paris, and then organize and decide on a final push to Berlin. The Germans weren't giving up. The Battle of the Bulge is a major example of that. But they did not win that battle. They could not sustain it. And it was only a matter of time before Allied forces would march into Berlin and capture Germany. Now, the big three that I mentioned, there was a lot of contention about how to do this. The Russians were coming from the east, and the British were coming from the west. The Russians wanted us to disrupt German life as much as possible. It was pretty evident that the Russians would get there first, and they did. So we started enormous amounts of aerial bombardments on German cities. And you're going to read about Hamburg and most notoriously Dresden. Dresden was not necessarily a city that had any type of munitions, guns, tanks, that kind of thing weren't being produced there. But we bombed the heck out of the place. Hundreds of thousands of people died. It's a very controversial move. In the fog of war, it's difficult to foresee how future generations will understand why the decisions were made the way they were made. Basically, at the time, as much disruption of German society as possible was necessary. This way, the forces could come in from the east and the west and capture. The last thing we wanted was a German army ready for attack. We wanted them on the roads. We wanted them bombed out of their cities. We wanted chaos, and that is what we brought. Unfortunately, that meant a lot of civilians. So, as we take our leave of this VFW post, there are many of these VFW posts across America, and there's in media as well. And in media, there's a fantastic World War II museum that I'd love you to visit if you had the time and pay your respects there. So, this arc of the narrative, what is it? I know you've been doing some really heavy studies of the Holocaust, and in these depressing times with the murder of George Floyd and the virus and killer hornets, for crying out loud, it really seems like there's no end, and that the tragedy just gets poured on. But the arc of the narrative of World War II is that there was tragedy, there was hardship, there was evil, but good prevailed, and it will again. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure you get the homework done. We'll have a meeting next week. Our final meeting of the year will be live. Please tune in. Our attendance at our live meetings has been a little light, and I'd really like to see you at our last Google Meet. So please tune in.